So good afternoon, good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about big data and microcredit. So for those of you who don't know, microcredit is basically a form of venture philanthropy wherein farmers who don't usually get access to basic financial tools are able to borrow money from individuals like ourselves. So I'm really invested in microcredit. I think it's something that's really cool. But today I'm even more excited to be talking about it in a big data context. Now, with my involvement with microcredit since 8th grade, big data has been a buzzword that's been thrown around, and I witnessed a lot of microcredit's development can be attributed to big data and its implications. So before I talk more about it, I'm going to expound on basically how big data informs microcredit through two questions that I encountered throughout my involvement with microcredit. So the first one is, how do we quantify impact? How do we attribute a number value to the betterment of somebody's life? Now, this is extremely important, especially with farmers, not only to ourselves, but also to the farmers themselves. A lot of farmers aren't able to access credit or access bank loans, not because they have bad history, but because they have no history at all. Now, big data, what it aims to do is to illuminate this credit history, whether it be a simple transaction of $10 borrowed from a neighbor, or if they hired a machine from a hiring company. All of this data should be quantified and tabulated and analyzed so that these farmers are able to receive loans in the future, and also so that we can really be able to solidify and understand the impact that we're creating, and really understand whether or not we're making a difference towards their lives. Now, the second question is, who do we lend to? Now, I know whenever I would lend to farmers, I would always choose it based on very arbitrary factors, such as their gender, the ambitiousness of their projects, or how many kids they have. Now, we understand that venture philanthropy is still something that we need to maximize allocative efficiency for. So in order for us to maximize the benefit that microcredit can deliver to these households, we should use big data to really come up with this figure through an algorithm and use that figure to inform our investment decisions so that we can say yes to more deserving entrepreneurs in the future. Now, I'm going to basically delineate the cash flow and the data flow in a microcredit system really quickly. So the first and foremost and most pivotal relationship is that between lenders and borrowers. So there's a simple cash flow, and then after that, these farmers are able to use that money to invest in whatever they want, whether that be pigs, chickens, wheelbarrows, combine harvesters, and then hopefully that money will start flowing back in a capital flow. And basically, this relationship of reciprocity is established, which is ideally what microcredit wants to do. And I identified three main areas wherein data can be collected to really expedite and make this system better. The first being behavior. So this is completely contained within the farmer households themselves. So we're able to know who these people are and how they behave. The second is returns on investment, and the third being payback. So the first thing we're going to talk about is behavior and how we're able to use big data to track the behavior of these households. So telecommunications presents itself as an excellent proxy. Now, you might not think so, but 85% of farming households actually have telephones, whether this be cell phones or landlines. And telecommunications become this excellent tool that provides us with correlations that helps us understand how these farmers behave. Tiaxa is actually a South American company which specializes in this sort of process, but it's actually not a very novel concept, and many communities across the world actually adopt it. So to talk about it, I'll talk about three separate scenarios. So the first scenario, we'll talk about Farmer A. So Farmer A, he checks his phone a lot. He checks his phone for the weather so he knows when the sun is going to come out for his crops. Now, in some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because he checks his weather so much, the weather for him is actually really good, and he gets really good harvest. So because he's conscientious, because he's aware, and because he's proactive, we can go ahead and give Farmer A a high credit scoring and lend to him. Now, the second farmer, Farmer B, he's on his phone from the hours between 9 and 5 a lot. So he's on his phone playing games, checking emails, calling people. And what can we infer from that? The fact that he probably does not have a very steady job, because otherwise he would be working. So we can go ahead and give Farmer B a low credit scoring and decide not to lend to him, because he probably has a really high rate of default. And the third farmer, Farmer C, he has a huge network of communications. And we can tell this from his telecommunication history. He calls a lot of people, emails a lot of people. And from that, we can extrapolate a high socio-demographic status and also basically opulence and a steady income. So we can go ahead and borrow to him. And the second place I identified is returns on investment. So how do we exactly track the returns on investment and the revenue flow? Because these are things that these farmers, because they don't want to jeopardize their chances of getting a future loan, they probably will lie about this. And in order for them to be honest, we need to track utilities. Now, the thing with utilities, it's not like telecommunications. However, it's this flow of cash that really mimics that of microcredit, and therefore it becomes a really handy tool for us to be able to track their returns on investment. So here's a diagram that basically delineates the two main liabilities that a farming household has. So they have the microcredit company, and they also have the utilities that they need to pay back on a monthly basis. Now with microcredit loans, you pay back once a year with interest, whereas utilities you pay back 12 times a year. So these utility companies, they already have these huge troves of data that basically account for when they paid back, whether they were late, whether they paid back at all. And when this information can be given to the microcredit companies, it becomes extremely valuable because these microcredit companies can use it to basically predict their habits and their revenue flow of these farming households who would otherwise not have a lot of incentive to be honest with these microcredit intermediaries. And therefore, we can track their revenue flow, their credibility, and whether or not they're willing and able to pay back. Now, the third thing, the thing that it ultimately all culminates to, is payback. So when you pay back, a credit scoring process takes place. Now, this process basically takes into account three things: your identity, your ability to repay, and your willingness to repay. So with identity, I talked about behavior and how telecommunications can become excuse me, an excellent proxy. And with ability to repay, revenue flow is obviously indicative of that. Now, willingness to repay, you might think is kind of weird, but there are actually a lot of farming households who want to take this money for themselves and not give it back. Now, the fact that there is a credit scoring system in place at all is incentive enough for them to repay, because understanding that their payback today is going to be indicative of their future ability to receive a loan is incentive and motivation enough for this system to work in a very reciprocal and sustainable manner. Now, I'm going to finally reflect on the big data implications of this entire thing. Now, the crux of the relationship between big data and microcredit is this idea of what and not why. Now, I talked about the farmer who checks his phone a lot. There's probably no scientific notion as to why it is that because you check your phone a lot, you get good weather. But that doesn't matter. All we need to know is a correlation. Just because one thing happens and the other happens, that's in essence what a proxy is. That is enough for us to really understand and inform our processes. And essentially with microcredit, it's something that we really want to implement on a large scale. And understanding that large scale means that we're not able to enter these households and understand them individually and why they do the things that they do. Big data becomes a really handy tool. And the second thing is the ethical implications. Now, with big data, ethical implications is always something that we talk about, breaches of privacy and jeopardizing your personal safety. That is something that big data opponents always bring up. And with microcredit, this is no exception, because a lot of people think that using telecommunications is a possible breach of privacy. Now, in grappling with that, we need to understand that there is always a trade-off that happens with big data, and really understanding that whether or not we think a violent means, and when I say violent, I mean a breaching of privacy, is able to justify a very benevolent ends. And lastly, I'm talking about not eliminating human touch. And with that, I mean microcredit is a wonderful thing that happens because of altruism, because of philanthropy, and understanding that a social responsibility is really grounded in compassion and grounded in our empathy, and using big data and numbers to completely replace that is probably something we don't want to do. So understanding that microcredit is all about stories and not really solely about numbers, and really harnessing the power of big data in a way that we navigate a balance that is healthy for both parties. So that is my presentation. Thank you.